The horse stopped before Jonah McCrae did, its ears pinned back, nostrils flaring, hooves grinding into the dirt as if the ground itself had turned sour. Jonah's hand tightened on the reins, not in surprise but recognition. He knew that smell: burnt canvas, old gunpowder, blood left too long under a hard sun. "Easy," he murmured, though the animal didn't need calming. It already knew what waited ahead. Jonah swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the earth with a dull thud. The prairie lay wide and open around him, deceptively calm. Tall grass bent lazily in the wind, a sky too blue for what it was about to witness. He took a few steps forward, slow and deliberate, his hand resting near his coat pocket where habit still lived, though need rarely did. Then he saw it. A wagon wheel split clean in half, spokes splayed like broken ribs. Canvas shredded and blackened, flapping weakly against the frame. A cooking pot overturned, its contents long since soaked into the dirt, and bodies. Too many, men, women. A child no older than Micah had been when Jonah first found him, half-starved near a burned mining camp. Jonah didn't count them. He never did. Counting made things feel orderly, and there was nothing orderly about this. He stood there a long moment, the wind tugging at his coat, dust curling around his boots. 3 years ago he might have knelt, might have said a prayer, but grief had burned that habit out of him. Same as it had burned out his houselotter, his wife's voice, the sound of a second set of footsteps moving through his days. Now he listened instead. Silence pressed in thick and wrong. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether it had permission to move. Jonah stepped carefully through the wreckage, eyes scanning for signs he already knew were unlikely. Raiders didn't leave survivors. Neither did men who killed for pleasure, and this had been that kind of killing, messy, personal, close. He crouched beside a fallen man, touching 2 fingers to a neck out of habit more than hope. Nothing? He rose, moved on. It was then he heard it. Not a cry, not even a breath, really. Just a sound so faint it might have been the prairie settling. Jonah froze, every muscle tightening at once. He turned slowly, heart beginning a low, heavy thud against his ribs. There, behind what remained of the wagon's rear axle, a shape, curled in on itself. Too still to be alive, too careful to be dead. Jonah crossed the distance in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees. A woman lay there, half covered by a scorched fur-lined cloak. Her hair was matted with blood and ash, her face streaked and pale beneath the grime. One hand was clenched tight around a scrap of lace, fingers white with the effort. He hovered a moment, afraid of what he might find if he touched her. Then he pressed 2 fingers lightly to her throat. There it was, a pulse, weak, stubborn. "Well," he breathed, the word leaving him before he could stop it. Not relief. Something closer to disbelief. She shouldn't have been alive. Anyone could see that. A gash ran along her temple, dried blood dark against her skin. Her dress, once fine, he could tell, was torn and burned, the fabric too delicate for a journey like this. Not a settler's wife, not a farm girl. Jonah slid an arm beneath her shoulders, another under her knees, lifting her with care. She weighed almost nothing, as if the world had already taken its share. Her head lolled briefly against his chest, and he felt her breath there, faint but real. Behind him the horse stamped and snorted uneasy. "Easy," Jonah said again, though this time it was meant for himself. He mounted with her cradled against him and turned west, away from the wreckage, away from the silence that felt like accusation. He didn't look back, he never did. The cabin sat low against the land, tucked near a stand of cottonwoods that bent and whispered to one another even when the air was still. Smoke curled thinly from the chimney. Jonah felt something loosen in his chest at the sight of it, something like a habit pretending to be comfort. The door opened before he reached it. Micah stood on the threshold, barefoot despite the chill, a rifle clutched awkwardly in his hands. He was all elbows and angles, a boy growing too fast into a world that rarely slowed for anyone. His dark eyes took in Jonah, then the woman in his arms. "What happened?" Micah asked, voice steady but tight. "Wagon," Jonah said. "Bad one." Micah nodded once, jaw setting. He stepped aside without another word, holding the door wide. Jonah carried the woman inside and laid her gently on the narrow bed along the far wall. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds, of leather and old pine. Safe smells. Micah hovered nearby as Jonah fetched water, clean cloth, the last of the salve he kept for burns and cuts. The boy watched every movement, suspicion written into the set of his shoulders. "She breathing?" "Yes." "How long?" Jonah shrugged. "Long enough." They worked in silence. Jonah cleaned the blood from the woman's face, careful around the wound at her temple. Her lashes fluttered once, but she didn't wake. Micah held the lamp steady, his hands not shaking though his eyes never left her.
"She don't look like she belongs out there,"
Micah said finally.
"No."
Jonah agreed. Micah hesitated, then asked the question Jonah knew was coming.
"We keeping her?"
Jonah paused, cloth hovering over the woman's cheek. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, a low, constant sound like breath.
"For now,"
he said. Micah nodded again, as if that settled something. He set the rifle back in its place by the door and moved to the stove, adding another log to the fire. The flames caught quickly, casting warm light across the room. The woman stirred once more, a soft sound escaping her throat. Jonah leaned closer, watching her face. Her brow furrowed, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Whatever dreams she was fighting, she fought them alone. Jonah sat back in the chair by the bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He'd thought he knew the shape of his days. Thought he'd earned the quiet he lived in, but the prairie had a way of undoing such assumptions. Micah crossed the room and stood beside him, gaze fixed on the woman.
"She gonna wake up?"
he asked.
"Yes,"
Jonah said, though he wasn't sure why he believed it.
"She's stubborn."
Micah's mouth twitched just barely. He nodded and went to fetch a blanket. As night settled over the cabin, Jonah stayed where he was, watching the slow rise and fall of the woman's chest. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a coyote called into the dark. Jonah listened, then leaned back, eyes heavy but open. He had no idea who she was, no idea what she was running from, only that she had survived something she shouldn't have. And that meant, sooner or later, it would come looking for her again. The woman didn't open her eyes until just before dawn. Jonah was still in the chair, the fire long since reduced to embers, the room cloaked in that cold hush just before morning. Her breath had steadied through the night, but every now and then, she stirred, murmured something, reached for something unseen, clenched her hand as if holding onto a thread. This time her eyelids fluttered open. Confusion hit first, then fear. Jonah didn't move. He just watched her come back to the world. Her gaze darted across the room. The wood stove, the pale blue curtain Micah had stitched up last winter, the single rocking chair near the window. Her eyes landed on him and didn't flinch. That surprised him. Most people flinched. "You're safe," he said, voice low, like he didn't want to wake the walls. She opened her mouth. No sound came. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, needing both hands to steady the drink. She sipped like it might vanish before she finished. When she handed it back, their fingers didn't touch. Jonah took note of that.
"You got a name?"
he asked, not expecting an answer yet. She paused, gaze drifting to the glove still on her right hand, pearl buttons dulled by suit and time. Her left hand was bare, scraped, bruised. Her fingers flexed against the blanket like she didn't trust them anymore.
"My name?"
she began, then shook her head.
"I don't remember."
It was a lie. Jonah knew the shape of lies. This one was stitched with fear, not malice. He didn't press.
"I guess we'll wait till you do,"
he said simply. She looked at him, really looked. There was suspicion there, but something softer underneath. Doubt, maybe? Or exhaustion so deep it couldn't hold anything else. Mike appeared in the doorway with a blanket over his shoulders and a frown set between his brows.
"She up?"
"Yeah," Jonah said without turning. Micah stepped in slowly, not like he was scared of her, but like she was a puzzle no one had solved yet. His eyes flicked to hers. She studied him right back. He gave a small nod, the kind boys give when they're trying to seem older than they are.
"I'm Mike."
He said. She didn't respond.
"That's fine,"
he muttered and turned toward the stove.
"I'll heat something."
Jonah watched the woman's face shift slightly, something between shame and confusion. She looked at Jonah again.
"You brought me here,"
she said.
"I did." "Why?" He shrugged. "Someone needed to."
A long silence filled the cabin. The fire crackled low. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the walls, like it had remembered how to move. Micah placed a pot on the stove and added water, scraping together something like broth from dried carrots and bone stock. The woman watched him, eyes unreadable.
"Was there anyone else?"
she asked, so softly Jonah barely heard. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Her throat worked, and she sank a little deeper into the cot. Micah poured a cup of tea for Jonah, then one for her. He handed it over like he didn't want it but was doing it anyway. She took it with both hands. Her fingers curled tight around the tin. The day passed slow. She slept again before noon. Jonah checked the snares outside. Micah chopped wood, only glancing in every hour or so to make sure she was still breathing. By late afternoon, she'd eaten a few spoonfuls of broth. Her color returned, faintly. She spoke nothing else, only nodded when asked simple things: if she was cold, if she needed water, if the blanket sat right. Micah didn't talk much either, but he watched her every move, eyes narrowed. Jonah noticed. That night, as Jonah cleaned the kettle and Micah folded a second blanket by the fire, the woman stared up at the ceiling with tears slipping silently down her face. Not shaking, not sobbing, just falling. Jonah didn't say anything. Micah glanced at her, then away, jaw tight. Jonah laid another log on the fire and said only,
"You're not alone here."
She didn't respond, but the tears stopped not long after. The next morning came dressed in mist, soft and slow. The woman sat up on her own, wrapping Jonah's old coat around her shoulders before moving to the door. She opened it quietly. The air was cold and clean. She stepped outside barefoot onto the porch and stood there like she hadn't seen the sky in years. Jonah found her like that, arms wrapped tight across her chest, the coat too big for her but warm.
"You'll catch cold,"
he said. She didn't look at him.
"I needed to see sky, to know the world still turns." He nodded. "It does, whether we ask it to or not."
She turned then and looked at him fully, for the first time without haze. Her eyes were gray, not pale, not sharp, just quiet. Eyes that had seen too much and maybe felt even more.
"I shouldn't be alive,"
she said.
"Maybe not. But I am."
Jonah stepped onto the porch, not too close.
"Then there's reason for that. Even if you don't know it yet."
She studied the prairie. A hawk circled somewhere in the distance. Dust rolled across the field like a whisper trying to find its shape.
"I don't know who I am now."
She admitted. He didn't speak right away. Then,
"Don't rush it. Let it come when it's ready."
They stood there together, not talking, not touching, just breathing the same cold air. Inside, Micah watched from the window, his small face pressed to the glass. He said nothing, just tucked the carving knife into his pocket and stepped outside without a sound, walking toward the shed. Later, after breakfast, thin cornbread and weak coffee, Jonah caught Micah outside, hands full of firewood, face unreadable.
"She lying?"
the boy asked. Jonah wiped his hands on his trousers.
"About her name?" "Yeah. Why not just tell us?"
Jonah looked toward the window, where she now sat with the coat wrapped around her like armor.
"Some names carry too much weight. Sometimes, you gotta set it down before you remember how to breathe."
Micah didn't say anything for a long time. Then,
"We keeping her?"
Jonah looked at the sky, then at the small boy growing too fast.
"She ain't ours to keep. But if she wants to stay, she's got a place."
Micah nodded, set the wood down by the cabin wall, and walked off without another word. That night, Jonah brought in the last of the wood and found the woman sitting at the edge of the bed, staring into the fire. She looked up at him, almost embarrassed to speak.
"I want to help," she said. "I can clean, I can cook, maybe."
Jonah raised an eyebrow.
"Probably not well,"
she admitted.
"You'll learn,"
he said. Her lips twitched, the beginning of something like a smile.
"Thank you."
Jonah nodded once, then moved to the corner and sat down. She watched him for a while, then lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Micah climbed into the loft above, footsteps soft and careful. Jonah stayed where he was, staring into the fire, his thoughts quiet but not still. He didn't know her name, didn't know her past, didn't know what brought her here or what might come looking. But he did know one thing. That glove didn't fall. She left it behind on purpose. The wind carried the storm in faster than the sky let on. By late afternoon, clouds rolled low over the plains, thick and bruised, dragging long shadows across the golden hills. The kind of storm that didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for warning. Jonah stood out by the corral, checking the fence line with a quiet urgency, glancing toward the cabin every few minutes, as if the roof might lift off without him there. Micah was already inside, stacking wood by the stove, grumbling under his breath about the smell of wet dirt and the way storms made the cabin creak like bones in bad weather. Inside, the woman, the one still without a name, moved from corner to corner like someone trying not to be noticed. She swept, wiped counters, folded wool blankets she hadn't unfolded. Her movements were neat, controlled, rehearsed. A dancer without an audience. Every time thunder rumbled, her shoulders jumped ever so slightly. When Jonah came through the door with his coat soaked to the elbows, she was staring out the window at the darkening horizon, hands clenched in the fabric of the apron she'd borrowed from the hook by the door.
"Storm's coming fast,"
he said, pulling off his gloves.
"I know."
She didn't turn. Her voice was low, brittle.
"You all right?"
he asked gently. She nodded, but the movement was stiff, sharp.
"I've seen worse weather. Not talking about the sky."
That made her look at him. Something flickered behind her eyes, panic maybe, or memory. She opened her mouth, then closed it. He didn't press. He just stepped around her, set another log on the fire, and stirred the coals until they caught. Micah handed him a towel.
"She's been pacing since noon."
The woman looked away, embarrassed.
"Storms bring up old things," Jonah said. "Sometimes the sky isn't the loudest part."
No one spoke after that. The wind clawed at the windows. Rain started, soft at first, then hard, drumming against the roof like it had something to say. The cabin groaned in the gusts, and somewhere outside, the barn door slammed open and shut with a rusty hinge cry. Micah climbed into the loft early, blanket over his head. Jonah sat in his rocker, carving the beginnings of a drawer handle. The woman sat by the fire, back straight, hands in her lap, still as stone. Thunder cracked once, close enough to shake the walls. She flinched.
"You ever play?"
Jonah asked suddenly, tilting his chin toward the dusty upright piano tucked beside the bookshelf. Her eyes flicked to it fast.
"No."
She lied. He looked at her a moment, said nothing more. Returned to his carving. Minutes passed. The storm got worse. She stood, crossed the room. Her fingers hovered over the piano's surface, not touching it, not yet. Then slowly, she slid the cover back and sat down. Jonah didn't look up, but he stopped carving. Micah peeked through the slats of the loft above, silent. She pressed one key. A low note, out of tune. Hollow. She winced. Another note. Then another. She didn't play a song, just pieces, fragments. Notes like thoughts left unfinished. But her hands moved with memory, not practice. Her back was straight, shoulders tight. But her fingers knew. Jonah closed his eyes just for a moment. He wasn't a man who chased ghosts. But the sound of that broken piano, hesitant, quiet, filled the room like something holy. After a minute she stopped. The storm was still raging, but the silence felt softer now.
"I haven't played in a long time,"
she said, not turning around.
"Couldn't tell."
Jonah said. She almost smiled. But not yet. Instead, she stayed where she was, fingers resting on the keys like they were something sacred. Micah whispered from the loft, not quite meaning to be heard.
"She remembers more than she says."
The woman's shoulders tensed. Then she stood, closed the piano lid gently, and crossed the room back to her chair. She sat down with her hands in her lap again. This time, they weren't still, they trembled. Thunder growled again.
"I was 10 the first time I heard a man scream,"
she said suddenly, staring at the fire. Jonah looked at her, so did Micah.
"I was standing in the hallway, wearing a dress too stiff to breathe in. I remember the wallpaper more than his face."
She paused. Micah held his breath.
"They pulled him out of the study by his collar. My uncle said he was a thief. That he was lucky not to be shot. But all he took was a letter."
She blinked once. Jonah waited.
"They punished him anyway."
Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't heavy. It was careful. Like everyone inside it had learned not to break things too quickly.
"I don't know why I told you that,"
she said.
"You don't need a reason."
Jonah replied. She turned her face slightly toward him.
"But you want to know, don't you?"
she asked. He met her eyes.
"Only if you want to tell it." She looked away. "I don't. Not yet."
Micah shifted in the loft.
"You will," he said softly, "when it hurts less."
Down below, she didn't argue. Jonah got up to stoke the fire. He added a log, stirring the embers until they glowed again. The warmth spread slowly.
"I want to play again." Jonah nodded. "Then play,"
she said. She looked at the piano but didn't move.
"Tomorrow," she whispered, "when the sky's not shaking."
Jonah returned to his rocker, sat down with the handle half shaped in his hand. Micah's voice drifted down like wind through tall grass.
"You still don't got a name."
The woman turned toward the loft.
"I have one." "Then why not say it?"
She met Jonah's eyes across the fire. Her voice was low but firm.
"Because it's not mine anymore."
Micah didn't press. She stood, pulled Jonah's coat tighter around her shoulders, and walked to the door. He didn't stop her, just watched. She stepped out onto the porch, barefoot again, the rain cold and insistent. But she didn't shiver. Lightning flared across the sky, throwing her silhouette into stark relief. Jonah stood behind her.
"You all right?"
he asked again. She stared out across the endless prairie.
"I don't know who I am without running."
Jonah breathed in slow.
"Then stop running."
he said. The rain fell harder. Her hair stuck to her face. She turned to him.
I don't know how.
Jonah nodded once.
Then we'll figure it out.
She didn't answer, but she didn't go back inside either. They stood there together, side by side, listening to the storm roar and settle and roar again. Behind them, inside the cabin, the fire didn't flicker. It held steady, and upstairs in the loft Micah rolled onto his side and whispered into the darkness,
"That's not my name anymore."
She whispers, but Jonah hears her anyway. The road into town felt longer when you hadn't traveled it in silence. Clara rode beside Jonah on a borrowed mare, her posture straight but her knuckles white on the reins. The sky had cleared, but the storm lingered behind her eyes. Every mile between the cabin and the general store pulled at something inside her, threads of memory, old fears tied too tight. She didn't say a word. Neither did Jonah. They didn't need to. She had insisted on going alone, but Jonah had offered to ride with her as far as the edge of town. It was a quiet compromise, like so much between them. Now the buildings came into view, the squat general store, the dusty saloon with its creaking porch swing, a church that had lost half its paint to sun and time, everything smaller than she remembered, though she had never actually seen it before. Jonah slowed his horse and stopped at the bend.
"This is far as I go,"
he said. She looked at him.
"You don't think I can handle it? I think you can. But I also think sometimes a person wants to feel the weight of their own footsteps."
Clara held his gaze for a second longer than necessary.
"Thank you,"
she said. Jonah nodded once, then turned his horse back toward the open prairie. She watched him go, the way his silhouette shrank against the hills, then disappeared behind a line of cottonwoods. The general store's bell rang dull and dusty as she pushed the door open. Inside smelled of dried herbs and old wood. Shelves were lined with jars of preserves, tins of coffee, bolts of fabric too coarse for Eastern hands. A woman behind the counter nodded once in greeting, not recognizing her. That was a blessing. Clara moved slowly through the aisles, picking up what she needed: flour, thread, a tin of lye soap, a packet of wildflower seeds she didn't remember reaching for. She was halfway down the last row when she heard the voice. Familiar, too familiar.
"My God,"
it said, soft, stunned. Her spine froze before her face did. She turned. A man stood at the counter mid-conversation with the shopkeeper, now staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. He was dressed finely for Wyoming. Dark coat, polished boots still dusty from the trail. His hair combed and slick, but wind had loosened it. His voice had the clipped smoothness of the East.
"Baroness,"
he breathed. Clara said nothing. Her heartbeat thundered so loud she barely heard the word. He took a step closer.
"It is you."
Her fingers tightened around the packet of thread in her hand. She didn't move.
"I'd heard rumors,"
he said, voice lower now but sharper.
"That you died. That the wagon was attacked, no survivors. Your uncle, he sent letters across every territory."
She still didn't speak. The man's eyes scanned her plain dress, the smudge on her sleeve, the borrowed coat that hung too loose on her frame. And yet, something in her bearing hadn't changed. She still held her chin like a woman used to being watched.
"What are you doing here?" he asked, incredulous. "Dressed like that, living like a, I am no one,"
she said. The words dropped like a blade between them.
"I suggest you leave me be."
The man blinked. Once, twice, then stepped back, like he wasn't sure if she was real or dangerous. She didn't wait for him to say more. She turned and walked out, the bell over the door jangling with urgency. She left the flour on the counter, thread still in her fist. She rode hard, too hard. By the time she reached the cabin, her breath was ragged, her mare lathered with sweat. Jonah was chopping wood out back. He dropped the axe when he saw her face. She didn't speak until she dismounted, until the cabin door was shut behind her. Then she turned to him.
"Someone recognized me." Jonah didn't flinch. "Who?" "His name doesn't matter." "But he knew. He called me Baroness." Jonah stepped closer. "Your real name?"
Micah stood from his stool near the fire, half-finished carving in his hands. He looked between them, sensing the shift in the room. She swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking.
"Clara Beauregard."
The name filled the cabin, thick and unwanted.
"My uncle is Adrian Beauregard. He's the last of a dying line with too much pride and not enough heirs. I was promised to a man twice my age in exchange for securing the family estate. I refused. I ran."
Micah set down his carving quietly. He moved to the window and stared out, jaw clenched.
"I bought passage west under another name. Hid in a wagon group headed to Montana. I thought I'd be safe with people who didn't know who I was."
Her voice broke slightly.
But I was wrong. Raiders found us anyway.
Jonah listened without interrupting. He didn't blink. Didn't ask anything more than she was willing to give.
I never meant to lie to you,
she said.
You didn't,
he said. Her brows drew together.
I never told you the truth.
He looked at her for a long moment.
You were surviving. That's not the same as lying.
She stared at him like she was waiting for the moment he'd turn cold, step back, lock a door that had just begun to open. But he didn't. Micah turned from the window. His voice was flat but steady.
You're not going back to them.
She shook her head.
I can't, even if I wanted to. Which I don't.
Jonah finally spoke again, voice low and even.
You aren't surprised. I'm not the kind of man people lie to because they think he'll understand, he said. I'm the kind they lie to because they think he'll forgive them when they can't carry it no more.
The fire popped. Clara stepped closer, her eyes searching his.
And do you?
Jonah looked at her like he'd looked at the land so many mornings before, measured, quiet, sure.
There ain't anything to forgive. I saw you before you said a word.
Clara shook her head slightly.
You saw a woman you wanted to fix. No, he said. I saw a woman who didn't need fixing. Only space to stop running.
Her breath caught. She pressed a hand to her chest like she was holding in something that might burst.
I don't know who I am without that name. But I can't carry it anymore. You don't have to, he said, not here.
She hesitated, then asked the question like a child testing hope.
Who am I?
Barely, gently.
You're the woman who plays piano like it's breath. Who burns bread but tries again. Who sleeps with one hand in a fist and the other in prayer.
She closed her eyes.
I think I could stay, she whispered. Just for a while. Just until I remember how to be. You already have,
he said. She didn't go to the side room that night. She stood by the bed for a long moment, then slipped beneath the covers, facing the ceiling, careful not to touch him.
I'm not asking for more than rest, she whispered. You don't owe me more. I know.
They didn't touch, they didn't sleep much either. But for the first time since the wagon, she wasn't afraid to close her eyes, and in the dark, with wind whispering through the cottonwoods outside, Jonah whispered back, They know I'm alive, and they're coming. Micah was the first to say it. He stood in the doorway of the barn with dirt on his hands and sawdust in his hair, squinting against the morning light. Clara was hanging clothes on the line, her movements slower than usual, her face pale. Jonah was working near the fence post, but his eyes kept drifting toward her like they always did now.
She's scared again,
Micah said. Jonah didn't answer right away. He drove the nail in with one clean strike and set the hammer down.
She has reason to be. Then maybe you ought to give her more than reasons to stay. Micah shrugged. A person can't stand in the middle of a storm forever. Eventually they either find shelter, or they run again.
Jonah turned to the boy, brow raised. Clara didn't run. But she did pace. She walked the edge of the property that day twice. Down past the creek, up near the split fence, across the bluff where the cottonwoods grew thin and tall like old sentries. When she returned to the cabin, her boots were muddy and her dress hem torn. But there was something new in her eyes. Not peace exactly, but resolve. That night, she told Jonah everything. They sat by the fire, a pot of weak coffee between them, Mike upstairs pretending not to listen.
My real name is Clara Beauregard, she said quietly. Daughter of Adrian Beauregard of Charleston. Old money, old power, all of it choking.
Jonah didn't react, he just waited.
My mother died when I was young. My father didn't know what to do with a daughter, so he passed me off to tutors and dowagers, until I learned to smile the way they wanted.
She stirred the coffee without drinking.
My uncle, his brother, saw value in me, not as a person, as leverage, a way to secure a trade alliance. He arranged a marriage to a man in New York, wealthy, connected, cruel.
Jonah's hands curled slightly around his mug.
I said no. He didn't accept it, so I ran.
Her voice cracked then, just slightly.
I paid a woman for her travel papers. Joined a wagon under her name. I was going to Montana. No one would find me there. I thought.
She stopped, swallowed.
I didn't count on raiders. Didn't count on being the only one left.
Jonah leaned forward, elbows on his knees.
You're not that name anymore. No, she said. But I don't know who I am without it.
He looked at her like he had looked at the open land the morning after Mary died. Like he understood the ache of not knowing who you are when everything's been stripped.
You'll find her,
he said, Micah came down the ladder softly like a cat and crossed to her. He held out a small carved horse, roughly shaped but sturdy.
I made this for you,
he said shyly. Clara blinked, took it in her hands.
Why? Because you look like you need something to hold on to, Micah said, even if it's small.
Clara held it close.
Thank you.
The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something new, something binding. The next morning, Jonah brought her to the cottonwood tree. It stood near the edge of the bluff, tall and wide, its bark marked by years of wind and weather.
This is where I buried Mary's ring,
he said simply. Clara didn't speak, but she knelt and touched the ground near the roots.
I figured, Jonah said. If I ever loved again, I'd bring her here. Tell her the truth.
Clara turned to look at him. The wind moved her hair across her face.
And what's the truth?
She asked.
That I thought I was done. Thought I'd already seen every kind of love there was. But then you came in, with ashes on your cheeks and silence like armor. And you showed me there's still more.
Her breath caught. She pressed a hand to his chest, just over his heart.
Say that again,
she whispered.
There's still more.
She closed her eyes, held on for a moment longer, then stepped back.
I'm not ready to be anyone's wife. Not yet. I'm not asking you to be. But I want to be someone's. Not something to be bought. Not a title to wear. Just someone worth choosing. You already are.
That night she cooked dinner. It was only potatoes and beans, a little onion from the cellar, but she moved with intention, like each task was a decision to stay. Micah set the table. Jonah cleaned his boots by the door. They sat and ate in quiet companionship. Afterward, Clara stood by the piano. She didn't ask permission. She just played. This time it wasn't fragments. It was a melody, soft, hesitant, but whole. The kind that felt like it had waited years to be played. Micah sat cross-legged near the fire, eyes closed. Jonah leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening like the music might teach him something. When she finished, she left her glove on the piano. Just one. A choice. Later, by lamplight, she sewed curtains for the window above the sink. Pale blue linen. Nothing fancy. But when she finished, she stepped back and smiled, not at the curtains, but at the room they now belonged to. Jonah found her in the doorway of the side room that night. She stood still, hands clasped.
You don't ask many questions, she said. I don't believe in earning trust with noise. Then thank you, Jonah. Her voice softened. You never asked what else I left behind.
She nodded slowly, considering that. He smiled, a rare full one. He didn't answer. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small gold ring, the blue stone dulled with wear.
This was my mother's. I didn't bury it with the rest.
Jonah's voice was quiet.
Why not? Because I didn't know what to do with it. Until now.
The next morning, she knelt under the cottonwood and buried the ring beside where Jonah had buried Mary's. Micah watched from a distance, arms folded tight across his chest, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of respect. When Clara stood, her hands were muddy and her breath unsteady. But she looked lighter somehow. That afternoon, Jonah built her a bench for the piano. Micah helped, sanding the corners, humming one of the tunes Clara had played the night before. When it was done, Jonah carved her name into the underside of the seat. Not Clara Beauregard, just Clara. As the sun dipped, they sat on the porch together, Jonah in his rocker, Clara beside him barefoot, a shawl around her shoulders. Micah lay on the steps, a dog-eared book in his hands. The sky turned to lavender. The cottonwoods rustled low. You're not running anymore, Jonah said. Clara turned to him, face clear in the fading light. No, she said, I'm choosing. And just beneath her breath she added, I don't want to be Clara Beauregard anymore. But I don't know who I am without her. The rider came just before dusk. Jonah saw him first, just a speck on the horizon at the edge of the ridge, moving fast and low in the saddle. Not a ranch hand, not a settler. The pace was wrong, too deliberate, too direct. He stood from where he'd been splitting kindling and watched as the rider cut through the golden light, raising a soft cloud of dust behind him. Clara stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes following Jonah's gaze. Micah appeared in the doorway a second later, his jaw tightening. Do you know him? Jonah asked Clara. Without turning, she didn't answer right away. Softly, no, but I know why he's here. Jonah picked up the rifle leaning by the door, not raised, just held. The man rode straight into the clearing, slowing as he reached the edge of the yard. He dismounted with practiced ease, dusting off his long coat like he just stepped out of a train station instead of the Wyoming plains. His revolver gleamed too bright on his hip, and his smile was too polished to mean anything good. He looked up at them, Jonah, Clara, and Micah, and tipped his hat.
"Evening," he said smoothly. "Beautiful land you've got here."
Jonah didn't answer. Clara stepped forward, just slightly. The man's eyes flicked to her.
"Evelyn,"
he said, like tasting the word.
"Or is it Clara now? Or something else altogether?"
She didn't move. Her face didn't flinch. But Micah took a single step closer to her, silent and sharp.
"Elijah Peterson,"
the man continued, now turning to Jonah.
"You've made quite the impression on our little search party. Mighty tough man to find out here. What's your business?"
Jonah asked, voice low and even.
"My business,"
the man said, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes.
"His family, yourn, hers. She doesn't belong to anyone." The man chuckled. "That's real noble. But see, where I come from, names mean something. Lines. Legacies. And our dear Baroness here left behind more than just a ring. She left debt, scandal. A very concerned uncle."
Clara spoke then, her voice cut like wind over stone.
"I owe nothing. I gave up that name, that life."
The man tilted his head.
"You can give up a name. Doesn't mean it gives you up."
Micah's hand twitched toward the knife in his belt, but Jonah held a hand out, subtle, calm. The man took a step forward.
"You gonna stop me?"
he said, eyes locked on Jonah.
"If I take her back?"
Jonah didn't raise his rifle, didn't move. But the air changed, it thickened, settled, anchored. Not like threat, like promise.
"She's not going," Jonah said. "Not now, not ever."
The man's smile faltered, just for a second.
"You'd really pick a ghost over a future."
Jonah stepped forward, slow and rooted.
"I'd pick the truth. And she's standing right here."
Clara moved then, stepping beside Jonah, not behind. Her shoulder brushed his, and she stared straight into the face of the man who'd come to claim her.
"I'm not afraid of you,"
she said.
"You should be," he replied. "But I'm not," she repeated. "Because for the first time in my life, I chose something. I chose this."
The man looked between them, his mouth open like he might say more. But then he just spat into the dirt, turned, and mounted his horse. He paused only once before leaving.
"You're wasting your title," he said to Clara. "Your legacy."
She straightened her spine.
"I'm living," she replied. "That's more than I ever did under that name."
Then he rode off into the dusk, swallowed by distance. Jonah didn't speak until the sound of hooves was gone.
"You all right?"
he asked quietly. Clara didn't answer. She turned, stepped back onto the porch, and went inside. Later she sat at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys, unmoving. Jonah made tea without asking. When he placed the cup beside her, she looked up.
"I need to do something,"
she said. Without waiting for his reply, she disappeared into the back room. He heard the trunk open. He heard her breath catch. When she returned, she was holding a ring, gold, with a pale blue stone. Jonah recognized it. She walked past him, out the door, and toward the cottonwood. He followed. At the base of the tree, she knelt, dug a shallow hole with her bare hands, placed the ring inside, covered it gently, patting the earth down like tucking something in. Then she stood, brushing the dirt from her palms.
"That part of me is buried now," she said. "I don't want it back."
Jonah didn't speak. He just reached for her hand. And they walked back in silence, not the silence of secrets, but the kind that comes after truth. And somewhere behind them, beneath the cottonwood tree, a name turned to soil and finally let go.
"I'm ready to bury her, but only if you help me dig."
The wind that morning carried no weight. It moved through the grass like a lullaby, soft and even. Clara stood by the open window, her hands wet with bread dough. Flour streaked across her wrists like chalky prayer lines. She hummed, just a little, as she worked the dough against the counter. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair was loose. Her heart, for the first time in years, wasn't running. Jonah stepped in quietly, brushing the dirt off his coat, a small box of nails in hand. He paused when he saw her, just long enough to take her in. The cabin smelled of yeast and firewood, the kind of scent that made a place feel claimed. She didn't turn to look at him, but she felt his presence and didn't flinch.
"How's the fence?"
she asked.
"Holding for now,"
he replied, setting the nails down. She wiped her hands on a cloth, pulled the bread into a rounded shape, and placed it gently into the iron pan. He watched the way her fingers lingered on the edges, adjusting, fussing, not out of worry but care.
"I've been thinking,"
she said, not turning around. Jonah raised an eyebrow.
"Dangerous habit."
She glanced at him then, eyes a little brighter than they'd been the week before.
"You ever think about what this place used to be before we filled it? He looked around, quiet, empty mind. And now?
He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. That evening she played again. The tune was fuller now, no faltering, no apologies. Micah sat nearby, carving quietly. And Jonah leaned in the doorway, watching like he always did when she played, as if the notes stitched something inside him back together. When she finished, she didn't move from the bench.
Jonah?
He looked at her, her hands stayed on the keys.
I'm not the woman you first found under that broken wagon. No, he said, you're more.
She swallowed, fingers tightening slightly.
Do you believe people can be born again? Not in the church way. In the real way.
He stepped closer, slow.
I believe people survive things they weren't meant to. And when they do, they gotta choose what comes next. Her breath hitched. And if I choose you?
Jonah was quiet for a long moment, then,
I've been hoping you would.
They walked that evening, up to the ridge where the cottonwoods stretched into the sky like guardians. Clara wore her shawl, hair braided over one shoulder. Jonah didn't say much. He let the quiet walk between them, soft and companionable. At the top, the sky stretched wide, orange and violet bleeding into one another. A hawk circled far off. Below them the cabin glowed with firelight. Home. She stopped, looking out over the land.
It feels different up here. Jonah nodded. This is where I come when I need to remember.
She said.
What? That the world don't end just because your heart breaks.
She looked down at the dirt beneath her boots.
I've broken so many times.
He turned to her.
And you're still here.
She looked at him then, full and open.
I think I'm in love with you, Elijah Peterson.
His answer was steady.
I know I am, Evelyn, if that's still your name.
A laugh slipped out of her then, quiet and surprised.
I think it is, she said. I think I want it to be.
He reached out, brushed a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear. They stood like that as the light faded, not kissing yet, just knowing. Later that night, she sat on the porch wrapped in his coat, watching the stars appear one by one. Jonah came out, 2 mugs in hand. He sat beside her, close enough to touch. She didn't reach for the mug, just looked at him.
Marry me,
she said, soft but sure. Jonah blinked once, then turned to her fully. She asked.
I've loved you in silence for weeks now, he said. I'd marry you 1,000 times in 1,000 lifetimes.
She smiled, something warm and full blooming in her chest. He reached for her hand.
If they come back, let them. I'm not running anymore.
The wedding was nothing like Clara had imagined as a girl. There was no lace veil, no cathedral bells, no silver-handled fan to flutter behind nervous smiles, no candlelit ballroom full of men in coats too tight and women who spoke in circles. Instead, it was just the 3 of them. Jonah wore his cleanest shirt, sleeves rolled up like always. Micah stood to the side holding a small wooden box with 2 simple rings nestled inside, carved by his own hand. And Clara, barefoot, hair loose, standing under the cottonwood where everything had been buried and begun. The vows were not spoken like ceremony. They were spoken like breath. Jonah looked her in the eyes and said, I'll stand beside you when the world is quiet. And when it burns. And Clara, with her hands in his, replied, You gave me back my name, not by speaking it, but by letting me choose it. Then they simply stood there, for a long time, their foreheads pressed together, while the wind moved gently through the trees like it, too, had been waiting for this. Weeks passed, the land warmed, the creek filled. Micah caught a rabbit big enough to brag about for 2 days. Clara planted wildflowers along the edge of the porch. Jonah repaired the roof before the spring rains could find new ways in. Sometimes they didn't talk much. Sometimes they laughed so hard at supper that Micah spilled stew across the table and Clara wept from joy, not pain. And sometimes at dusk, she played the piano. It wasn't perfect. The notes stuck or echoed strange in the cracked wood, but it didn't matter, because it was hers, because she wanted to. One evening, she and Jonah sat on the porch, watching the sun tuck itself behind the hills. He passed her a tin cup. She took a sip, then looked at him sideways. You know, she said, I still don't know exactly who I am. Jonah leaned back in the rocker. Don't reckon I do either. And that doesn't bother you? Nope. Means we got time to figure it out together. She nodded slowly, letting that settle. I used to think love was a cage, she said. A pretty one maybe, but a trap all the same. He turned toward her. And now? She looked out at the wide, endless plain. At the fence line Jonah had built. At the smoke curling from their chimney. Now I think it's a door, she said. One I chose to walk through.
The name Baroness Evelyn Beauregard.
He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They never heard from the rider again. Clara suspected her uncle had received word she'd vanished west, and decided some things were better left lost. Or maybe the man who came had realized what Jonah already knew: you don't own someone just because you knew their name once. Either way, no one else came, faded like fog in the morning. What remained was Clara. Just Clara. The wildflowers bloomed in late April. Purple and yellow clustered along the porch like confetti. Micah whittled better now. His carvings had faces and hands, horses that actually looked like horses. He started calling Clara by accident one day. He didn't take it back. Neither did she. One morning, Jonah came in from the barn with a splinter in his hand and a softness in his voice.
"She's got something to tell us,"
he said. Clara was in the kitchen, hands pressed gently to her stomach, eyes already misty. Jonah just smiled and kissed her temple. Micah looked like someone had handed him a miracle.
"Really?"
he asked. Clara nodded.
"Boy or girl?"
She laughed through her tears.
"We'll find out. But either way, they'll grow up knowing they were born in a place built on choice, not fear."
Months later, as the first frost kissed the windows, Clara stood on the porch in her shawl, watching Jonah in the yard, swinging an axe with steady rhythm. She touched her stomach where new life moved beneath her palm and closed her eyes. There had been a time she thought her story had ended the night the wagon burned, but that was just a page. This was the book she never knew she was allowed to write. Not because she was given permission, but because she stayed, because someone waited beside her instead of asking her to move. Because he never asked for her name, only her truth. And maybe that was the meaning after all, that love doesn't come to fix the broken. It comes to sit beside the wound until healing chooses to arrive. That identity isn't something you inherit. It's something you build nail by nail, song by song, breath by breath. That home isn't made of blood or name or history. It's made of hands, of hope, of the brave, quiet choice to begin again. And in that quiet cabin under the cottonwoods, with bread in the oven and laughter down the hall, Clara was finally home.
"I'm not who I was, but I'm everything I chose to be."